We started last week looking at Jerusalem because, still have my newspaper down here. President Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish people, which is like recognizing that we have a nose in the center of our face. It's rather obvious there, but nonetheless, thank you, Mr. President, Jerusalem. And so I gave a lesson last week about the significance of that. And in light of that, then, I want to take for a few weeks here and study Jerusalem, actually, and some of the history of Jerusalem. And there's an outline back there for you. Those of you online, the outline's available as well. And today I want to talk about Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. Let me talk about several things we're going to have in the next few weeks. Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. Next week, we'll look at Jerusalem prior to the time of Jesus and see a little bit of the history of how Jerusalem came about. And then we will jump ahead to Jerusalem, Jerusalem through its battles, I guess you could say, because down through the years, there have been many, many times when Jerusalem was the center of world attention and was attacked and decimated, and we'll look at that. Then I want us to look at Jerusalem spiritualized, because there are a lot of writers, and one of the most famous is a guy named John Bunyan. You remember him, Pilgrim's Progress? A lot of writers who spiritualized Jerusalem. In fact, you've done it too. Because we stand here many times, or have in the past anyway, and sang songs like, "We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God." And yet, you still haven't registered to go on the trip. So, you're not really marching to that Zion. So we've spiritualized Zion, and we'll look at the spiritualization of Jerusalem and whether that's appropriate or not appropriate. And then, since I was talking about Jerusalem, I've been asked several times, because there's some work that has been done in recent years about where the temple actually stood. Now, the common assumption is that the temple stood where the Dome of the Rock is today. But there has been some work by archaeologists and pseudo-archaeologists to determine, is the place of the Dome of the Rock the actual place of the temple? And there's some theories out there that the temple wasn't even there, that it was somewhere else. And we're going to look at those theories and see where the temple actually stood, and look at some of that. So that's where we are. Well, let's talk today about Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. All in favor, say aye. Good. Excellent. The name, first of all, Jerusalem, where did it come from? It is one of those names that, if you ask around, going to have a lot of different meanings. People will say different things about Jerusalem. I think that probably the safest bet is, but there is obviously the shalom or shalem in there, and of course shalom means peace, and shalem is peaceful. We've got the peace, Melchizedek, king of Salem. King of Shalem is in Hebrew it would come across. And then we've got the Jeru. So where does the Jeru come from? We think it probably comes from Jireh. Jireh Shalem. Jireh Shalem. In fact, if you hear a Hebrew saying it, they say much more like Jireh Shalem. Yerushalem is the way they would say it. They don't have the J sound. It's a Y sound. Yerushalem. And that Jireh is, you may remember, when Abraham was taking his son Isaac, and he was taking him up to Mount Moriah, and Mount Moriah happens to be, anyone want to guess? Jerusalem, you got it. In fact, what today is considered Temple Mount. When he's taking Isaac up to Temple Mount, and Isaac says, well, we have the wood, we have the fire, but where's the sacrifice? And Abraham says, what? Jehovah Jireh. God will provide. And indeed, God did provide the ram in the thicket, you may remember. It is the rabbis say, anyway, and when you hear that phrase, the rabbis say, that means there's a lot of tradition behind it. That's as far as you can go. So the rabbis say Abraham named it Jireh, that later Shem had named it Shalem, and those two things came together, Jerusalem, and it is God will provide and peace put together. At the time of Jesus, and really or much earlier on, Jerusalem was the intersection of the north, south, east, and west. And so, politically speaking, everybody had to go through Jerusalem. I think you could give the argument that Jerusalem would be a place of importance and turmoil, even if there was not a religious setting to it. There are some places that are just so strategically important that that's what it is. And Jerusalem is one of those places. And I put on the outline a little picture that is an ancient map, actually. It's hard for you to see. But in that picture, you may notice it looks like flowers. In fact, it's often called the Jerusalem flower. And there's 3 petals to the flower. If you could actually see this, and if you look that up online, what you would see is that those flowers are labeled as continents. There is Europe and Asia and Africa. And Jerusalem is the center circle there. In fact, just to show you how prevalent that is, you can go to Jerusalem today, and on the sewer covers, you will see that symbol. It is a symbol that those 3 petals of the flower have, for ages and ages and ages, pictured Jerusalem as the crossing ground for if you're going from Europe to Asia, or from Africa to Asia, or from Africa to Europe. You end up having to go, especially in the ancient world before you had an airplane, you ended up having to go through Jerusalem. And that was obviously before air travel and before Suez Canal and all those kind of things that might have cut some of that out. So Jerusalem became the crossroads of the world and the important place in the world. In fact, let's look up Psalm 48, verse 2, and make sure we quote it correctly as it speaks of Jerusalem. In fact, verse 1 says, "Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, the city of our God in the mountains of his holiness, beautiful for situation. The joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion. On the sides of the north, the city of the great king. God is known in her palaces for a refuge, for lo, the kings were assembled, and they passed together. They saw it, and they so marveled, and were troubled, and hasted away." And you can go through there, and it speaks about the challenges of Jerusalem nonetheless, but the city of our God, the mountain of his holiness, Mount Zion. All of these are references, of course, to Jerusalem, and it speaks of Jerusalem as the joy of the whole earth. Well, I think that you could say, indeed, that Jerusalem in many ways is the joy of the whole earth. You could also say Jerusalem is the envy of the whole earth, and you could also say Jerusalem is the curse of the whole earth, that all of the earth has been enamored with Jerusalem, trying to go and get Jerusalem and attack Jerusalem and control Jerusalem. And it's not just in modern times that the world has believed that Jerusalem belonged to them. I think there's nothing, of course, historically through that, but the joy of the whole earth. I think that if Donald Trump had announced that Jerusalem was an international city, belonged to the whole earth, everybody would have been fine. But he didn't announce that. He announced that it was the capital of the Jewish state, and that's what caused everyone to have all of their problems, because everyone wants Jerusalem. In fact, the book of Zechariah calls Jerusalem a cup of reeling. A cup of reeling. That is, it is bitter and sickening, but the nations can't help but take the cup. They're always reaching out for that cup. Even though it is bitter and sickening, they're going for it. And So when you come to the time of Jesus, then, the city of Jerusalem very much was a Roman city in many ways, but the Romans had done a good job about letting the Jews put have their personality within it. And so you come, and Herod the Great had completed some massive works in the city. We'll talk about some of those here in a moment. But the city of Jerusalem, by the time of Jesus, really was the pristine city in the Middle East. It was the place that all the world, again, would come. And outside, really, I think, of Rome itself, the city of Jerusalem was the most spectacular city in the world. In fact, maybe you could even say it outshone Rome in some ways. And I've given you a map, if you can look at that, I'm not sure, down at the bottom, that maybe will help you understand the city of Jerusalem just a little bit at the time of Jesus. I wish I had a big map here behind me to look at, but if you look all the way over on the left side, there's the Mount of Olives, and it shows the Mount of Olives at 2,682 feet. The Mount of Olives is not in Jerusalem, or at least was not in Jerusalem. At the time of Jesus, the Mount of Olives was not in Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives, however, was the place where you would tip over and you would immediately see Jerusalem. And that was your first glimpse of Jerusalem as you came from the Mount of Olives. That was for anyone who came from the north or the east. You would always end up. And that's because Jerusalem's far south, and everything below Jerusalem is pretty much desert. It's not real habitable area. So most people who didn't live in Jerusalem ended up coming over the Mount of Olives. And it both then and today provided the most spectacular entrance into the city of Jerusalem. In fact, I prefer to come into Jerusalem when we have tour groups. I prefer to come in from the Mount of Olives, from the east. This past time I was there with our two groups, just because of the directions we were coming, one group we were able to do that, the other group we weren't able to do it, and I'm always a little upset, although I didn't tell the people on the second tour, you got the bum deal. Should have come in the other side, because when you come in from the east, you come in from the Dead Sea or from the north, which ends up at the same highway, and coming in through the Mount of Olives, you have such a spectacular sudden entrance that we always play the song, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. And I've been there enough times now, I know exactly when to start the CD so that your first glimpse hits the Jerusalem, and every eye tears up, and it's a moving moment, no matter how many times you do it, to see the spectacular city come out before you. So even in Jesus' day, that was the spectacular view when you came over the top of the Mount of Olives, and you would look down then upon Temple Mount. So on your map there, you see Mount Moriah. If you can read that there, that is actually Temple Mount. So Mount Moriah is 2,400 feet above sea level, 2,440. That's a little bit below the Mount of Olives, so you can look down upon it. And between the Mount of Olives and Mount Moriah, on this particular map, I get through it, it says the Valley of Jehoshaphat. I wonder why everyone's sitting in the back today. It says the Valley of Jehoshaphat. The Valley of Jehoshaphat is the same as the Kidron Valley, and in the New Testament in Jesus' day, it was most often called the Kidron Brook and the Kidron Valley. The brook was at the bottom, of course, and the valley there. And it actually is a pretty steep valley to walk down and back up the other side. Then across that is Zion, and there actually is that Mount Zion over coming to the left, and Mount Zion is the place where much of the city itself was, the temple being on Moriah, and Zion there. Now, all the way to the left, you see the Valley of Hinnom. It's hard to read there, but do you notice that where it says Valley of Hinnom? Valley of Hinnom, again, is what in the New Testament is often called what? Anybody know? No? You'll know it as soon as I say it. Gehenna. Gehenna. And Gehenna was a place that in the Canaanite days of the city, prior to David, in the Canaanite days of the city, there was it was a place of human sacrifice, honestly. The people would literally take their babies there and sacrifice them to these Canaanite gods. And so it became a place of paganism and considered a place of the curse of God. And so actually in Greek and even more so in Hebrew, the name Gehenna came to be equivalent to what? Not quite. Yes, hell. It came to be known as hell. So that Valley of Hinnom or Gehenna came to be known as hell. Now, again, in Jesus' day, the city itself really was surrounded by those two valleys. On your map, it's called the Valley of Jehoshaphat on the eastern side and the Hinnom Valley or Gehenna on the western side. And those two came together. And where they came together was actually about 640 feet lower than where those valleys started. So you're definitely on a hill, and it's a hill that's got a valley on either side, and it becomes almost, you might even say an island. It's not surrounded by water, but it's got this moat around it because of these valleys, the Valley of Hinnom on one side, the Valley of the Kidron Valley on the other side, or the Jehoshaphat Valley. So you've got on this little triangle piece, the only way you can get to the city without going through one of these valleys was from the north side. Otherwise, you had to go down and up. Well, that's why it was a very safe city, impenetrable, yes. It was a very safe city, hard to get to because of those valleys. And you could protect the north end. And from the either of those valleys, you could see someone coming. They would be struggling to get up. So very safe for them to live there. There is, right in the middle, you may see on the map there, there's a valley called the Turopian Valley. It's hard to see there, but you may see it says Uphel. If you see Uphel on your map there, and just to the left of Uphel is the Turopian Valley. The Turopian Valley, actually, if you go to Jerusalem today, is indistinguishable from anywhere else because over the years the Turopian Valley was actually built in. It was filled up with debris and construction and whatnot, and yet in Jesus' day the Turopian Valley was still there. And in fact, King Herod lived where it says Zion. King Herod lived on that side. The temple on Mount Moriah, and King Herod, being fat and spoiled as he was, didn't want to walk down the Turopian Valley and up to the other side to get to the temple, so he actually had a bridge built so that he could walk on level ground all the way. And they have actually discovered this bridge. It is actually buried now beneath Muslim quarter homes, but they've dug in under there, and you can go, as we typically do when we're there, and get a tour of the underground, and you'll actually see what's called Wilson's Arch, which is part of that old Herodian structure. Think of a Roman aqueduct. Remember the arches that they had, stacked several levels high, and Wilson's Arch is part of that aqueduct. It was called Wilson for Charles Wilson, the archaeologist that discovered it in the 1870s. So he had a bridge built, and according to Josephus, anyway, though the evidence has never been found, there was also a bridge built from the Mount of Olives across the Kidron Valley, or the Jehoshaphat Valley on your map. So two bridges there, so you didn't have to walk all the way down the valley and all the way back up the valley. We know of at least the one on the Turopian Valley that was there. Now, Alfred Edersheim was a Christian preacher. He was not a dispensationalist, and yet I still pretty much recommend him because typically Edersheim wrote about just what the scripture says and how it related to history. So he didn't have a lot of theological spin on it, and his books are actually very interesting. He wrote one called The Temple, Its Ministry and Its Service. And Edersheim was a converted Jew, so he brought a lot of his Judaism in and the explanation of Judaism. But here's what he says about Jerusalem in the days of Jesus. He says, sheer up from these encircling ravines. Now, the encircling ravines are Jehoshaphat and Hinnom. Sheer up from these encircling ravines rose the city of marble and cedar-covered palaces. Up that middle cleft, that's the Turopian Valley, up that middle cleft, down in the valley and along the slopes of the hills, crept the busy town with its streets, markets, and bazaars. But alone and isolated in its grammar stood the Temple Mount. Terrace upon terrace, its courts rose, till high above the city, with its enclosure of marble cloisters, cedar-roofed and richly ornamented, the temple itself stood out of a mass of snowy marble and of gold, glittering in the sunlight against the half-encircling green background of Olivet. In all his wanderings, the Jew had not seen a city like his own Jerusalem, not an Antioch in Asia, not even imperial Rome himself excelled in the architectural splendor, nor has there been, either in ancient or modern times, a sacred building equal to the temple, whether for situation or magnificent, nor yet have there been festive throngs like the joyous hundreds of thousands who, with their hymns of praise, crowded toward the city on the eve of a Passover. Edersheim wrote in the 1800s, and that had that style of one sentence to cover everything, but nonetheless, I think what you see here is Edersheim tries to describe the beauty of this city. And just imagine that you've got the beautiful mountains that it's built upon, which are always green any time of the year, green and lush. It's surrounded really by desert, and yet they're always green and lush. And with all of this, then, you've got the temple that stood, some say, 20 stories tall. It was a huge building. And it's covered in marble. And in addition to that, it's got gold. I don't know. Have you seen pictures of Petra? I didn't bring a picture of Petra with me, but of course Petra's in Jordan today. And what you see today is just red sandstone. But those fabulous facades in Petra were actually covered in white marble, and often the pillars covered in gold. So even more spectacular then, and they're spectacular today. So we think we have spectacular buildings, but I just, when you see the massive size of those buildings and see just the hints of what they used to be, and all we have is a hint, and we're still impressed with it. So Jerusalem in the time of Jesus was an unbelievably beautiful city, and had been for many years under King Herod, especially, as we'll talk about in a moment. Now, a few other places that you'd see in Jerusalem in that day. Of course, I've already mentioned the Mount of Olives to the east. The Mount of Olives was, it is said, just somewhat of a natural garden. It still today is very green with cedars and pines and palms and, of course, olive trees. But would have been I guess we'd call it, the national park. You would go there for beauty and look over into the city. Also in the city, in Jesus' day, unlike, say, Solomon's day, in Jesus' day, on the north corner of the temple was built something called Antonia's Fortress. This was built in Mark Antony's day, in, what would that be, 50 BC? And it was just a fortress of 4 towers, and it was a military barracks. It was the place where they would keep a couple hundred soldiers at any time, because if there was then and now going to be some kind of uprising in the city of Jerusalem, it was going to be on Temple Mount. And so they just built a barracks right there on Temple Mount so that they could be there and take care of it. So Antonia's fortress would have been prominent in that day. You got Herod's Palace in across the Turopian Valley, and Herod's Palace was the judicial headquarters, the governmental headquarters of the things of the city of Jerusalem. There's a question whether or not the pavement. Remember, Jesus says they took him to the pavement or the praetorium in the crucifixion. There's a question whether or not that was in Antonia's fortress, or they're actually beginning to think more. Next week I won't have a cold. They're beginning to think that it was probably in Herod's palace that this was. They're really just beginning to excavate Herod's palace. And the problem with excavating things in Jerusalem is that for 2,000 years, someone's built something on top of it. And so they have to dig underneath someone's house, not just someone. You can take a big palace like this, and they've got, it goes on forever. So Herod's palace would have been there. And the high priest place, Caiaphas' home, actually has been excavated, and it's several tiers on a hillside, complete with palace and dungeon and everything else that you would have in that kind of a complex there, which aligns with the scripture, which speaks about Peter being on the lower level of the courtyard. And everything lined up perfectly. Now, the temple then was, to help you get your temple periods right, temple was on Mount Moriah, and the temple was originally built by King Solomon. And does anyone remember why that particular location was selected? That's right. David wanted to build it, gathered all the materials. Exactly. And when it was selected, it was already considered to be, at that time, the place of Mount Moriah where Isaac offered his son. But it was, remember at the time of David, it was actually the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Those names might ring a bell as you're saying, oh, yeah, I've heard that before. I don't know anything about that, but I've heard that before. The threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Well, the city of Jerusalem, remember, prior to David, was a Jebusite city. Who in the world are the Jebusites? They're like the... Yes. So you've got the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the termites and all of those. With all of those, you've got this Jebusite city that you may remember I mentioned last week, and we'll perhaps do a little more next week. This Jebusite city was never conquered by Joshua. And so the Jebusites remained surrounded by the Israelites, and it wasn't until the time of David that they conquered the Jebusite city. They were friendly all along, but it just didn't belong to them until the time of David. Now, in the time of David, David did the thing that he wasn't supposed to do, and that is he counted the armies. He counted his troops. And the reason he wasn't supposed to do that is because the king of Israel is not supposed to rely on his armies. He's supposed to rely on God, but he counted his armies, and so God offered him some punishments. It's actually one of these times when God says, "Here's three choices that you can take for your punishment." And by the way, did your parent ever do that to you? And didn't you hate that when they offered you your punishment? And one of the punishments, the one that he chose, was 3 days of plague. And the plague started in the north and must have been a visible type plague, like, say, the angel of death. And literally tens of thousands were dying as the plague moved from north to south. And even before the 3 days were over, the scripture says that it came visibly down the Mount of Olives, and it was coming up then, down that Jehoshaphat or Kidron Valley, up to Mount Moriah, and the city of David was much smaller than Jerusalem, but it was right there. It's coming up, and David sees on the threshing floor. The threshing floor is the high place. On the threshing floor, he sees the angel of the Lord. Now, the angel of the Lord, I think, is the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. And so he sees the angel of the Lord standing there, and he begs, even though the 3 days is not over, he begs that the plague be stopped. And the angel of the Lord stops the plagues right there. I'm not making this up. It's actually in your Bible. And he stops the plague. And so David says, I need to build a place of sacrifice, an altar, on the place where the plague was stopped, where the angel of the Lord stopped the plague. And so he goes to build the altar, but he needs to get the property. And so he goes to Araunah, the Jebusite, who owned the threshing floor, and said, I want to build an altar. And the Jebusite, Araunah, said, fine, build an altar. And David said, I will not offer unto the Lord that which cost me nothing. You got it. Enough hints, you eventually get there. I'll not offer unto the Lord that which cost me nothing. And so he insisted that he buy the threshing floor. And the real estate transaction is actually listed in the scriptures, one of three real estate transactions, all of which are contested areas today, by the way, on the world saying, well, Jewish people don't really have any heritage or history there. And yet here it is, David saying he bought the threshing floor. And then he built an altar, but determined then to build a temple. And it was then that the Lord said, no, you can't build the temple. And so David prepared everything and let his son build the temple. So the temple itself was built by Solomon about a little less than 1,000 years before Christ. That temple lasted until 586 BC. In 586 BC, excuse me, that temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. And all of the Jews were taken off to Babylon. And then it was later, 70 years later, under Cyrus the Persian, that the people were allowed to go back. And we have in the scripture the story, for example, of Nehemiah, the rebuilding of the walls, Ezra, the return of the exiles, and the little book of Habakkuk is about the rebuilding of the temple. So the temple was then rebuilt. You may remember from Habakkuk, when the temple was rebuilt, the people said, the old men who remembered the old temple, they wept, saying, it's nothing like the first temple was. The young men, they rejoiced because now we have a temple for the first time in our lifetime. And the temple was reestablished. It is that temple, then, that Jesus served under. That's called the Second Temple. And it's called the Second Temple because it's the Second Temple. That's right. First one was Solomon's, destroyed in 586, rebuilt by the return of the exiles. And the Second Temple then was in existence in Jesus' day, and it was destroyed. Anyone remember the year of the destruction of the Second Temple? 70, that's right, 70 AD. Now, the thing is, however, that King Herod, remodeled the Second Temple, remodeled to the point that you could almost call it the Third Temple, except that it really was the same one. He enlarged, he changed everything about it, basically, so that it was far more spectacular than any of the temples that had ever been, than the previous temple, even Solomon's temple had ever been. And what Herod did, beginning about 19 BC, And according to the book of John, it lasted 43 years of construction. In fact, it was 43 years and about 10,000 laborers every day for 43 years. This is good. By the way, Herod didn't have slaves. Did you know that? Herod had employees. He paid them all, and Herod understood. He understood economics pretty good. He understood the politics pretty good, and so he paid his workers. From what we can tell, he paid them pretty decently. He paid them to the point that they wanted to work for him. They had a good job, and he built all these fabulous works. The pinnacle, of course, which is the temple. What he did was build a wall around Mount Moriah so that even today you can't really tell that it's a mountain. He built a retaining wall. And then he filled it all in. And the retaining wall is absolutely unbelievable, even in what you can see today and what exists today. Some of the stones that he used are, I don't even know how to describe the massive size, but I'm going to say just by eyeballing it, I've seen stones that are about the length of this building right here and pretty close to the height of this building and are one single stone, and they're not at the bottom of the wall. They're way up high. And think a semi-truck trailer, that size of a single stone moved in. We try to figure out how they did it. To this day, best we can do is guess how in the world, engineering, did they get these stones all into place? But it was so massive that even with the destruction of Jerusalem, that retaining wall stayed and is there. Much of it there still unto this day. So by the time Jesus comes along then, I don't know where I am on my outline, by the way. By the time Jesus comes along, you've got this spectacular temple that is there, and it is carried out. At the time of Jesus, of course, let's talk about politically, because it would depend on if you're talking about when he was born or when he died. When he was born, you may remember that, behold, Magi arrived from the east, saying, where is he who's been born King of the Jews, right? We've seen his star in the east, and we are come to worship him. And Herod, when he heard this, was very greatly troubled. This was Herod the Great. This was the Herod that had built the temple complex, and this was the Herod that, about the time of Jesus' birth, was very close to his death. When Herod the Great died, he, all through his life, really was would megalomaniac be the word? What's a megalomaniac? Hitler. He was very threatened of his power, and it got even worse the closer he got to his death. Most people would say there must have been some kind of mental illness there, because even 5 days before he died, everybody knew, including him, that he was going to die. But he became concerned that his son was going to take the throne before he died, and he had his son executed. Right? I mean, this is the kind of guy he was. But Herod the Great had served from about 39 as actual king of the Jews. Now, can you be a king of the Jews and not be a Jew? Yeah, sort of. Herod was actually a Jew. What kind of Jew was he? Well, he was, if you look into it, Herod was an Idumean. And an Idumean is from Edom. And Edom, the Edomites, Idumean and Edomite is the same thing. The Edomites are descendants of, does anybody remember? Yeah, you're. It's one of those things that, again, when you hear it, you're like, oh yeah, I knew that. Esau, the descendants of Esau were the Edomites, and of course Esau was the brother of Jacob. So you got Jacob and Esau, or you've got Israel and Edom. The Edomites are not Arabs per se. They're Shemites and very very closely associated with the Jewish people through that connection there with Esau. So Herod was a descendant of Esau or an Edomite. Now, the Jewish people just I'll say 100 years prior to King Herod, the Jewish people actually conquered the Edomites, and it's the only time in the history of the Jewish people that they required forced conversions. It's actually very un-Jewish to do. The Jewish people actually, and has been all through history, except for this one little oddity, the Jewish people typically discourage conversions. And if today, I don't encourage it, by the way, but if today you decided you wanted to become a Jew, they would do everything they could to keep you from becoming a Jew. You can eventually do it, but you're going to have to show you really want to. But in this one little period of time, from about 165 to 65 BC, they conquered the Idumeans, and they required them to convert. Well, it is those converted Idumeans that Herod comes from. And his father, Herod's father, became the king of Idumea. And then Herod, by 64 BC, the Romans came in, and so the Romans picked from this royal family of Idumea and said, well, Herod, you're a Jew, and your dad was the king. We're going to make you king of Judea. And originally he was a tetrarch or some of those, not quite king, but anyway, he eventually made it to be the king of the Jews. So, yeah, he was Jewish under this forced conversion, and he understood Judaism enough to play the political game. But Herod died, again, right about the time of just a little bit after the birth of Jesus, because you remember the story of the slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem. Herod died. Herod's son, make sure I get my Herods correct here. Herod's son Archelaus became king of Judea. Actually, when Herod died, his kingdom was divided between three sons. Herod Archelaus took over Jerusalem and Judea, and from everything we can find out, he was totally incompetent. And the Roman people knew he was totally incompetent, and so by 6 A.D., Herod Archelaus was sent off to Vienna. He lived out the rest of his life in Vienna. He died in Vienna, and so Judea itself, in the days of Jesus, after 6 A.D., was ran directly by Rome. That's why when Jesus died, there's no King Herod, is there? What you have when Jesus died is Pilate, the governor. And so that southern portion is after 6 A.D., just read by the governors. Herod Philip was another son. He took over the far north. In fact, you remember Caesarea Philippi? Who do men say that I am is where Caesarea Philippi took place. Caesarea Philippi was built. It was a city built by Herod Philip, and it was to honor the Caesar and to honor himself. So Caesarea Philippi. And he ruled there till his death in 34 A.D. Herod Antipas then ruled Galilee, where Jesus grew up. So Jesus grew up under Herod Antipas. And remember, actually, when Jesus came back from Egypt, they realized, okay, Herod the Great is dead, so they come back, but they don't come back to Judea. Herod Archelaus is in Judea. Herod Archelaus was as messed up as his dad, maybe even more, so much, again, that by 6 A.D. they took him off the throne. So it says, when they heard that his son, Archelaus, was in charge, they went on to Galilee. Because Herod the dad had been in charge of all of it, but Herod's the son weren't. So Herods get very confusing, have you noticed? Because they're all Herod somebody, and trying to put them together. Well, after those three sons of Herod began to die, then, just to tie some of those Herods together, there was Herod Agrippa the First. Herod Agrippa the First actually pulled together again the kingdom of his father, where he was the king of the whole thing once again, and the king of the Jews. Herod Agrippa is the one who in 44 AD, it's recorded in the book of Acts, came into the theater at Caesarea, not Caesarea Philippi, but Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea by the sea, came into the to the theater, and the people said, after his rousing speech, said, "It's the voice of a God and not a man." And as they were shouting, he said, "You're exactly right. The voice of a God and not a man." And do you remember what the Lord did? So, an angel of the Lord came and struck him, and he died being eaten with worms from the inside. It's one of my favorite stories to tell when we get to that amphitheater right there, saying, "Let me tell you what happened here once 2,000 years ago." So he died in 44 AD. His son took over, Herod Agrippa II. That's the Agrippa that Saul or Paul, the apostle, stood before. So that would have been the great-grandson of Herod the Great. Now, all of that, and I think I'm out of time. But Jerusalem, at the time of Jesus, let's just say that it was a beautiful city, a well-run city, a city that was in the hearts of the people. It was a city that was considered almost public property for all the Jews. It is believed that, from some rabbinical writings, that if you had a place in Jerusalem, you were prohibited from locking your doors, that any house was public property, and it was so because the Jewish people had to come at least 3 times a year. They had to come to give their sacrifices and to be in Jerusalem for the feasts, and they needed a place to stay, and so all of Jerusalem was open to everybody, and it was this place that took in such a strong place in the hearts of the Jewish people that they said, even in the days of the exile, "If I forget Jerusalem, may my tongue cleave to the top of my mouth, tie my right hand behind my back." Basically, they were saying, "A curse on me if I ever forget Jerusalem." We'll put that together in coming weeks, but next week we'll talk a little bit about, we'll back up a little bit in our story and see how Jerusalem came to be. Well, let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll dismiss before our service. Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity of some study today, and pray that it has been enlightening and will be encouraging to us. In Jesus' name, amen.